Welcome to week 14. In this week, we're going to look at lists and classes. And our aim for this final week of Python sessions is to focus on the language of Python. So we will be looking at how we can get lists and use them inside classes and connect up different types of classes. So first of all, a quick recap of what we have covered. What we did is we wrote a class for a stick figure, and in that class we had various different things like the head, the arms, the legs. We had some methods to do with drawing. We had a method to do with undrawing, move, color, etc. So we had this class over here, and then what we did was, let's use a different color, is over in our client code. So if this is our client or our test code, we created a Windows using GraphWin, if you remember, and then what we ended up doing is an interesting thing. We wanted to create a collection, a list of stick figures. So we created a stick figure collection. So for short, I'm just going to call it SF collection. And we created a global variable, which was empty. Created a loop, popped in a loop. So let's use a different color. So there was our loop, beginning of our loop. And inside our loop, we got some points. If you remember from clicking on a mouse, we used those points and passed them into a stick figure which we created. So this is the line that creates our stick figure. Okay, and we passed in these points from the previous line, and they were passed into here. And then, use a different color. What we did is, and a crucial line is our collection over up here. We then, using the append method, we added in SF, our stick figure that we built. So this is quite a straightforward process. Okay, so we got our points, we create our stick figure, and that uses the constructor from over in our stick figure here, right? And the rules are you have to give it an X and a Y. You'll look at the detail of the code on the sheet, but I'm just trying to keep to the concept. Once we've created this object from the stick figure class, we then added it into a collection. And this collection is, if you can see up here, simply a list object in Python. Now, we can do lots of other different things. We can loop through this collection, which we'll look at, and we can make all of the objects that all the stick figures we create move, draw, undraw, etc., etc. It gives us a lot of control and power. But what I said from the previous session was that this client code is doing a lot of work. In fact, it's having to create a global list object in order to do this stuff here. And the reason we don't really want that is we give over too much control and too much mechanism, right? Too much of the implementation is over in the client. The client and the test code should simply call the methods, use the objects, the classes we use, but it doesn't implement all these details. It doesn't specify a list object and then have to go through all of this type of stuff and manipulate those directly. We want to hide this whole behavior. So what do we do and how do we do it? Well, sticking with the concept we have before, over here we have our stick figure class. Okay, and look at the code and remind yourself what's inside here, and that's a Python code class. In here you have your member variables, your constructor, I'm just going to put a thing in there, and then your methods in here, right? So this is your class. Over here, what we do is we introduce another class, right? And then finally we have our client. So this is our client, which is going to do all the testing code. Here is another class. Now this class I'm going to call stick figures. It's in the plural, okay? It is like the one in the blue, another class, but we're going to talk about what's inside this particular class here. This class, the purpose of this class is actually to manage the list of all of these objects. So our client simply needs to create one of these objects and then use this class which wraps the list object and manipulates it, and inside it it deals with all of these classes. So inside this class here, crucial piece of data that we're going to have in there is your collection. So our collection that we had in the client previously is going to become a member variable of this class here. Then the methods inside this class will access this, loop through this, get data out, put data in, create an object, etc., etc. And then so when we come to our client, and the client, remember, the logic is really important to understand how we're thinking. We do keep a separation here, and this separation is really quite important. Everything that I'm just underlining, these two classes, should be reusable in any number of environments. The client, in theory, and in practice it's a little bit more technical and fiddly, but the principle is this: the client should be, or allow you to have, a mobile app, a web app, a desktop application, a different language in theory as well. And the idea is the client just uses these classes, turns them into objects, and then runs them. But all the work is done here, and all the complexity is hidden away in this relationship of these classes here. So just before we move on, that class will be turned into an object and used as an item inside this collection. So what we are going to do in the next series of slides is actually build up this class and then test it. So what needs to go in here? Well, if it's a class, it needs a constructor, then it needs methods and member variables. This is the instance or member variable, this collection, this list of this class here. Okay, and we call it stick figures. So pay attention to that. The actual written notes which accompany this video give you considerably more detail, but I'm going to sweep through and make sure the concepts are as clear as possible. So imagine this canvas in front of you is the stick figures Python file. Okay, so that's what we're inside. So the very first thing is we really need a constructor. So the first question is our constructor. Well, what we're going to say for this constructor, and look at the notes to look at different ways you can construct this, and I would ask you to experiment with different options and ideas. This constructor, my simple idea is to say that for this particular constructor, bear with me a second, I am going to, you always have to have the word self. I'm going to pass it a window. So the idea is that when I construct the stick figures, I give it the window. So in my client, I create my graph win, pass it into here, and then this stick figures no longer needs to constantly have the window passed to it. It'll have an internal variable which will store that reference. So what's going to go on inside my constructor for this particular thing? I'll pause there and let you think. What do I need to do? Well, obviously the window, but what else? Clearly, if I'm going to have a list, then I want some way of managing a member variable. So all member variables which belong to the class start with the word self. And what I'm going to say is I'm going to create a variable lazily. I'm just going to call it list. Okay. And in my constructor, I'm going to create an empty one. Why am I doing that? Because when I build my stick figures, I don't necessarily want to add in any items to my list. I just want to get a list created and ready for use. So when I build stick figures by my client, and I pass it the window, one of the things it's doing hidden away from me is just create a list ready for me to start manipulating it. So I also need to manipulate this window. So I'm going to create an internal member variable, which is going to hold a reference. So I don't have to keep on passing. I'm going to call it WND short for window, and I'm going to pass it win. So I'm taking that variable and I'm passing it here, and then I'm going to store it internally. So remember, the word self attaches this variable across all the member methods and functions, or methods we'll try to stick to, for this class stick figures. That's what this allows. If you don't use this word in another method, you won't get access to these. So you need to use this word self. It attaches it to the class. So that's essentially it. That's what my constructor is going to do. So if I just very briefly look at my client or my test Python file, I'll do all my imports. Okay, so there's that top section up at the top. Please look at the worksheet to see everything you need to import. There's several lines that you need to import. But crucially, I create my Windows graphic window. And remember, the sheet will explain that this is just one approach. You can create this window inside your stick figures class if you want to. But I will leave that open to you to play with and look at the advantages and disadvantages. But for this example, I'm going to create my window graph win with all the stuff which goes here, but I'm not going to worry about specifying it for this example. You know, this is the proportion, the header, etc. Then, crucially, I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to call it SFS, short for stick figures. I'm going to call the stick figures, remember it's plural, constructor, and I pass it this window. And that's how I would create my use my client with my constructor. So let's return to our stick figures class file. So Python up there. Okay, so this is our class file. We've already sorted our constructor out. So let's just say that I'm not going to write it all out, but I'm just going to sketch it out just to remind you. There's your stick figure, and there are the lines of code for that. What I'm interested in now is using this stick figure, this class, to create and add stick figures based on a position. So initially what you were doing in previous weeks was simply creating stick figure and then adding it to the list, and you were doing that in the client code. Now I want to do it here inside the stick figures class. So I'm going to create a method. I call it add in terms of adding. I always have to have my self keyword, and the variables I want to pass are my x0 and my y0. So what am I going to do inside the stick figures? Well, I'm going to let's use a different color, bear with me a second. I am going to call the stick figure constructor, and I'm going to pass it x0, y0, as I did previously, but now this is inside the stick figures class. So I create it there, and then internally within this code I get my list, which is hidden from the public, and I call append, and then what do I add in? The stick figure I have just created. So what I've done with this method here is move all of that mechanism and process of adding and creating an individual stick figure and appending it to the list out of sight. So my client simply needs to create the stick figures, get a pair of points and call add, pass those points into the add method, and it will internally create a stick figure and add it to the list. So we're still inside the stick figures class, and so far all we've done is just create our individual stick figure and added it to the list. But we have no mechanism to draw all the stick figures that I have. And what would be really neat is if I had a simple way of drawing. So let's just quickly, we've got the init, the constructor code. He says drawing it really badly, right? Which is there. We now also have an add method inside our stick figures, which we've just talked about. So what we're going to add now is a draw method. Now this draw method is for stick figures, not for a stick figure. It has its own draw method. If you're not sure what I mean, go back and look at the file for stick figure, the class for the individual stick figure, and you will see there is a draw method. Inside that method is the head, the body and the arm all being drawn. Okay, where we are doing something slightly different. So watch what we do here. So here we call a draw method. We don't pass it anything, but we always have to use our keyword self. And what's going to happen inside here? Well, this is the clever bit. Because we've put all of our stick figures in a list, I can use a nice little loop, and I'll write it out for item in self.list. What does self.list? Let's change the color just to emphasize the fact that this is a member variable of this class. Okay, let's use a blue. Self.list. So let's just briefly talk about what this is. This code here goes to the list, and we use self.list because it's the member variable we created and we've been adding to, right? So remember, you can use add as many times in your client as you like with different points, and it'll just add it to this list. This line here will loop through the list, taking each item of the list, and I've called them item. So that value or variable there is then an individual item of this list, which we know is just a stick figure. And then I can call the stick figure's own method draw. And so look at this. It's very, very clever and requires a little bit. So if I get item and I do draw, the method I'm calling here, and remember I have to pass it a window, go back and have a look at the code for the stick figure. So this is a stick figure because that's all I'm storing in the list. I'm calling a method called draw. So go to the stick figure class and you'll see there's a draw method. It needs a window, and then it itself will draw the window. So this now, in one very, very clever and useful step, allows me creating a collection of stick figures and then drawing them. And I can repeat this concept of drawing. I can do move, so I can move my figures. I can decide which ones. I can have some more logic in here, so as I pull them out of the list, I can have the first three move, and other ones do different things. Very cleverly I can expand this code. Let's now have a look how this code might look if we're going to use it. Okay, so let's have a look at the client. Now the detail of this is all in the sheet. So follow the concept, follow the idea, and then you can refer to the sheet. So for this very final video, part of this first video, we're back to our client. Okay, and we're going to test what we've done. Remember, all the import statements, you need to make sure that you get them right. Have a look at the files that I give you and make sure you get all your imports right. Otherwise, files won't connect. So we've created an add, a draw, and a constructor. How do we use it? Well, obviously, first of all, as we've said before, we create our graph win and put all the details we want there. We then create our stick figures object from the stick figures class and pass it that window. So now it's got a reference to the window. Now, in the code on the sheet, I use a loop, but here I want to just focus on the concepts. What I can do is I can get my get points. Right, let's use a different color. Bear with me a second. I can use, so I want to get my X and my Y, and I use my get points method function, which is in the and I pass it a reference to the window. This gives me my points. Then I simply say to stick figure, I call my add, and I pass it these two values. And what we know is this line here creates a stick figure and adds it to a list. Now, if you're not sure what that means, go back and have a look at the previous slides or go back and look at the files. That's all that's required. So if I wanted to create a loop, I can take that pair and I can loop that as many times as I like. And within that loop here, I can get new points by clicking different places and I can create stick figures. So it's a really easy mechanism of building up objects. What I don't have is a simple mechanism of drawing them all. Now, what we did previously is we used a loop inside our client and then we went through the list and asked to print them. But because we've hidden that all away inside my stick figure, come out of my list and I can simply call draw on my stick figures, and that draw, if you remember from the previous slide, will loop around the internal list that's storing all the individual stick figures, and it will call the draw method from each of the stick figures and it will draw them. It's an incredibly powerful way of coding, and I would recommend you watch this video several times. The sheet goes on and looks at how to create a house class, how to adjust the constructor so you can create that, and how to create different classes, different scenes, and so on. And I would recommend you look at all of the remainder of the code and see how that works.